In the spring of 1987, on a Tuesday afternoon in late March, Carl Hendricks stood in the parts and service lot behind Westfall, New Holland in Greenfield County and made a decision his father told him not to make. He was 34 years old. He had been farming his own ground for 11 years, and he was about to sign papers on a New Holland 8340 tractor that cost more than his father had ever borrowed in his entire life. The machine sat in the second row, still cold from transport, blue and black paint clean in a way it would never be again. 105 horsepower, cab with heat and air, hydraulics that could pull equipment his current tractors couldn't even lift. It wasn't the biggest model New Holland made that year, but it was far bigger than anything Carl had ever owned. His father, Leonard, had driven him to the dealership that morning. Leonard didn't say much on the drive. He didn't need to. Carl already knew what his father thought. Leonard Hendricks had farmed 480 acres his entire working life and never once bought a tractor new. He ran used Fords in the 60s. He bought a New Holland in 1972 at an estate sale for $3,800 and drove it until the transmission went in 1983. When he replaced it, he bought another used New Holland, a 1978 model, paid cash, and considered the matter settled. Leonard believed in three principles: own your land outright, own your equipment outright, and never let a dealer convince you that bigger was the same as better. He had raised Carl in those principles, and now Carl was about to violate all three. The loan Carl was signing wasn't just for the tractor. It was structured against a parcel of land that had been in the family since 1952, 80 acres on the south end of the property, that Leonard's father had paid off in full the year Leonard graduated high school. The dealer, a man named Bob Kemper, had explained the financing carefully. The rate was reasonable. The terms were long. The land was collateral, but Carl wasn't selling it. He was leveraging it. It was, Bob said, what every forward-thinking farmer in the county was doing. Carl's neighbors were buying new equipment. They were expanding. If Carl wanted to keep up, if he wanted to keep farming at all in 10 years, he needed to make moves now. Leonard didn't argue with Bob Kemper. He just looked at Carl and said, "Your grandfather didn't borrow against that land to buy it. You're borrowing against it to buy a tractor." Carl signed anyway. He told himself his father didn't understand how things had changed. Farming wasn't what it used to be. You couldn't stay small anymore. You couldn't run 40-year-old equipment and expect to compete. Carl told himself all of this, and some of it was even true. He brought the New Holland 8340 home on a flatbed in early April. His wife, Janet, came out to the driveway and stood with her arms crossed, watching the unloading. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to either. Carl had told her about the loan 2 weeks earlier, and she had asked him one question. What happens if we have a bad year? He had told her they wouldn't. She hadn't believed him, but she also hadn't stopped him. That was how their marriage worked. Carl made the farm decisions. Janet kept the books and raised their 2 sons and waited to see if Carl's decisions held up. The first year with the New Holland was good. Carl planted early, got decent rain, and pulled a better yield than he'd seen in 3 seasons. The 8340 handled his 12-row planter without strain. It pulled his chisel plow through heavy ground his older tractors would have bogged down in. By the end of harvest, Carl had convinced himself the loan had been the right call. He made his first payment on time, with enough left over to feel like he'd made progress. His father never asked how the payment went. Carl never told him. The second year was harder. A late spring pushed planting back 2 weeks. June was dry. July was worse. By August, Carl was watching his corn curl in the heat and doing math in his head he didn't want to do. The yield that fall was 60% of what he'd projected. The payment on the New Holland was the same as it had been the year before, but the income wasn't. Carl made the payment, but it took most of what he'd saved from the good year. Janet asked him again, "What happens if we have another bad year?" Carl told her they'd figure it out. The third year, 1990, wasn't bad. It wasn't good either. It was average, which in farming means you break even and hope you didn't miss anything. Carl made his payment. He kept his head down. He didn't talk to his father about the farm anymore, and Leonard didn't ask. They saw each other at church and at family dinners, and they talked about the weather and the grandkids and nothing that mattered. Carl told himself that was fine. Families had distance sometimes. It didn't mean anything permanent, but the distance wasn't just with his father. It was with the farm itself. Carl had bought the New Holland to expand, to take on more ground, to do what Bob Kemper said every serious farmer was doing. But expansion required more than a tractor. It required renting or buying more land. It required more seed, more chemicals, more labor, more everything. And every piece of more required either cash Carl didn't have or credit he was already using. So the New Holland sat in the equipment shed next to his older tractors, capable of far more than Carl could afford to ask of it. By 1992, Carl was farming the same acreage he'd been farming in 1987, but now he was doing it with a loan payment that assumed he'd doubled his operation. He thought about selling the 8340. He even called Bob Kemper to ask what it might bring used. Bob told him the truth. Tractors depreciate fast, and the market was soft. Carl would take a loss, and he'd still owe the bank the difference. Selling wasn't a solution. It was just a different kind of failure. That same year, Leonard's health started to go. Nothing dramatic, just the slow accumulation of 71 years spent doing hard work in bad postures. His knees went first, then his back. By the spring of 1993, he couldn't climb into a tractor seat without help, and he stopped trying. He sold his remaining equipment at a private sale to a neighbor and moved off the farm into a small house in town. He didn't ask Carl to take over his ground. He rented it to another farmer, a man named Peterson, who paid cash rent and didn't require family conversations. Carl didn't fight him on it. He understood. Leonard didn't trust Carl's judgment anymore, and Carl couldn't argue that Leonard was wrong. The New Holland 8340 sat in Carl's shed, half paid for, underused, and proof of every doubt Leonard had ever had. Janet kept the books. She didn't editorialize, but Carl could see the numbers as well as she could. The farm was surviving, but it wasn't growing. The equipment loan was surviving too, one payment at a time, but it was eating margin Carl used to have for error. Then, in the fall of 1995, Carl got a call from a farmer named Ed Rowley. Ed farmed 800 acres 2 counties over, and he was looking to step back. He had a son who wasn't interested and a daughter who'd moved to Minneapolis. Ed wanted to retire, but he didn't want to sell the land. He wanted to rent it to someone who'd take care of it, someone who wouldn't mine it and move on. He'd heard Carl's name from a seed dealer. He wanted to know if Carl was interested in taking on 320 acres. Carl said yes before he'd even done the math. This was what the New Holland had been for. This was the expansion he'd planned for in 1987. 320 acres would double his operation. It would justify the equipment. It would prove the loan had been a good decision all along. He called Janet from Ed Rowley's kitchen and told her they were taking the ground. She asked him how they were going to pay for the inputs. He told her they'd finance it. She asked him what happened if they had a bad year. He told her the same thing he'd told her in 1987. They wouldn't. The first year on Rowley's ground, 1996, was decent. Not great, but decent. Carl planted late because the ground was new to him and he didn't know its drainage. He got an average yield, paid his rent, paid his inputs, paid his loan on the New Holland, and broke even. The second year was better. He knew the ground now. He planted earlier, managed it tighter, and pulled a strong yield. He made money. Not a lot, but enough to feel like the risk had been worth it. Janet kept the books and said nothing. Carl's father asked him once how things were going. Carl said fine. Leonard nodded and didn't ask again. By 1998, Carl had been farming Ed Rowley's ground for 3 years, and the operation was working. It wasn't comfortable, but it was working. He was running the New Holland hard now, the way it was meant to be run, and the machine was holding up. He'd put 4,000 hours on it in 11 years, and aside from routine maintenance, it hadn't cost him anything major. That was the year Carl started to believe he'd made the right choice. That was also the year everything else started to go wrong. First, Ed Rowley died. Heart attack, sudden, no warning. Carl went to the funeral and met Ed's daughter, a woman named Stephanie, who worked in corporate real estate and had no intention of keeping her father's farm. She was polite. She thanked Carl for taking care of the ground. And then she told him she was selling the land, and his lease wouldn't transfer to the new owner. Carl had 60 days to finish harvest and get off the property. He lost 320 acres in a single conversation. The rent had been reasonable. The ground had been good, and now it was gone, because Ed Rowley's daughter needed liquidity more than she needed a tenant farmer 2 counties away. Carl went home and told Janet. She asked him what they were going to do. He didn't have an answer. The problem wasn't just the lost acreage. The problem was that Carl had built his operation around that acreage. He'd bought a second planter. He'd upgraded his grain storage. He'd hired seasonal help. All of that had been financed on the assumption that the Rowley ground was stable. Now it wasn't, and Carl was left with equipment and capacity for an operation he no longer had. He tried to find replacement ground. He called every landlord he knew. He drove to farms with for rent signs and left his number. But 1998 was a bad year to be looking for ground. Commodity prices were falling, land rents were rising, and every farmer in the region was trying to hold on to acreage, not give it up. By the spring of 1999, Carl was back to farming his original 480 acres plus 80 he'd picked up on a short-term lease that paid more than the Rowley ground ever had. The margins got tight again. The payment on the New Holland was still there, every year, same amount, same deadline. The equipment loan had another 4 years on it. Carl was 51 years old, and he was back where he'd started, except now he owed money he hadn't owed before, and his father had been proven right in ways Carl would never admit out loud. In the summer of 2001, Leonard Hendricks died. Pneumonia, complications, 2 weeks in the hospital. Carl sat with him near the end, and Leonard asked him one question. "Is the farm going to make it?" Carl told him yes. Leonard looked at him for a long time and then said, "I hope so." Those were the last words they had about farming. Leonard died 3 days later. Carl inherited the 80 acres his father still owned, the same 80 acres Leonard's father had paid off in 1952, the same 80 acres Carl had borrowed against to buy the New Holland in 1987. The land came to him free and clear, because Leonard had never borrowed against it again. Carl added it to his operation and kept farming. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was farming his grandfather's land on his father's terms, but only because he'd bought a tractor his father told him not to buy. The New Holland 8340 stayed in service. Carl ran it through the 2000s, through years that were good, and years that were bad, and years that were forgettable. The machine never quit. It burned oil after the first 7,000 hours. The cab heater stopped working in 2004. The hydraulics started leaking in 2006. But it kept running, and Carl kept making payments until the loan finally closed in 2003, 16 years after he'd signed the papers. By then, Carl's sons were adults. The older one, Michael, had gone into teaching. The younger one, Travis, had stayed close to home but worked at a parts supplier in the next county. Neither one wanted to farm. Carl didn't push them, he understood. Farming had gotten harder, not easier, and the margins that used to exist didn't anymore. The decisions that used to make sense didn't anymore either. In 2007, the farm economy started to shift in ways Carl hadn't seen before. Corn prices climbed, then they climbed higher. Ethanol demand was pushing the market. Land values started rising. Farmers who'd been cautious for decades were suddenly refinancing, expanding, buying ground they'd never dreamed they could afford. Carl watched it happen. He watched neighbors take on debt that made his 1987 loan look small. He watched them buy new equipment, lease more ground, build new grain bins, and he didn't join them. Janet asked him why. The opportunity was there. Prices were good. The banks were willing. Carl could expand now the way he'd wanted to in 1987. He could take on more ground. He could justify newer equipment. He could, for the first time in 20 years, operate from a position of strength instead of survival. But Carl didn't move. He told Janet he'd already learned what expansion cost. She asked him if he regretted the 8340. He didn't answer. The truth was more complicated than regret. The New Holland had worked. It had done exactly what Carl had bought it to do. It had pulled his equipment. It had farmed his ground. It had lasted longer than most tractors ever do. The problem was never the machine. The problem was that Carl had bought it at the wrong time, for the wrong reasons, with the wrong assumptions about what came next. And now, 20 years later, watching other farmers make the same kind of bet he'd made in 1987, Carl couldn't tell if they were being smart or foolish. The only difference was timing, and timing in farming is everything. By 2008, the boom was over. Corn prices dropped, credit tightened. The farmers who'd expanded in 2006 and 2007 were suddenly over-leveraged in a market that didn't care. Carl watched 3 operations within 10 miles of his farm go under between 2009 and 2011. Equipment auctions that used to draw 20 people were drawing 200. Dealers were repossessing tractors that were less than 4 years old. The same banks that had been eager to lend in 2007 were now calling loans and forcing liquidations. Carl didn't gloat. There was nothing to gloat about. The farmers who went under weren't fools. They'd made the same calculations Carl had made in 1987. They'd believed the market would hold. They'd trusted the advice they were given. And the market had changed on them, the way markets always do, and the advice had been wrong, the way advice often is. Carl had survived because he'd been burned once and refused to be burned again. That wasn't wisdom. It was just scar tissue. In 2011, Carl was 63 years old, and he started thinking about what happened next. He didn't have a succession plan. He didn't have anyone to pass the operation to. He could rent the ground out the way his father had. He could sell it the way Ed Rowley's daughter had. Or he could keep farming until he couldn't anymore and let someone else figure out what came after. He kept farming. The New Holland 8340, now 29 years old, was still in the rotation. It wasn't the primary tractor anymore. Carl had bought a used New Holland T6 in 2009, paid cash, and that handled most of the heavy work now. But the 8340 still ran. It still worked. And Carl couldn't bring himself to sell it, even though he knew he should. In the spring of 2014, Carl had a conversation with a farmer named Russell Doan, a man about 15 years younger who'd been renting ground near Carl's property. Russell was expanding. He needed more equipment. He asked Carl if the 8340 was for sale. Carl told him it wasn't. Russell asked why. Carl didn't have a good answer. The tractor was old. It was inefficient. It cost more to maintain than it was worth. But Carl had bought it in 1987 to prove something to his father, and selling it now felt like admitting his father had been right all along. Russell didn't push. He bought a different tractor from a different farmer and kept expanding. By 2016, Russell was farming 1,200 acres. Carl was still farming 560. The math was obvious. Russell had done what Carl had tried to do 30 years earlier. The difference was that Russell had done it at the right time, with the right financing, in the right market. Carl had done it too early, with too much risk, in a market that didn't care. Carl's wife Janet asked him once why he still kept the 8340. He told her he didn't know. She said, "Yes, you do." And she was right. He kept it because it was the thing he'd fought his father over. It was the decision that had cost them years of easy conversation. It was the piece of equipment that had forced every hard choice Carl had made since 1987. Selling it wouldn't change any of that. But keeping it meant Carl didn't have to admit those choices had been mistakes. The tractor itself didn't care. It sat in the equipment shed through the winters, cold and quiet. Paint faded to a color that wasn't quite blue anymore. Carl started it every few months to keep the engine from seizing. He changed the oil. He greased the fittings. He kept it running the way you keep an old dog alive. Not because it's useful, but because letting it go feels like betrayal. In 2017, Carl had a health scare. Nothing major, but enough to remind him he was 74 years old and his body had limits. His doctor told him to slow down. Janet told him to retire. Carl told them both he'd think about it. But thinking about retirement meant thinking about what happened to the farm, and Carl still didn't have an answer for that. Michael, his older son, had a teaching career and a family in another state. He wasn't moving back. Travis, the younger one, had worked his way up to management at the parts supplier. He made good money. He had benefits. He had weekends. He wasn't interested in giving that up to farm 500 acres on margins that hadn't improved in 30 years. Carl didn't blame him. He'd raised his sons to have options. They'd chosen the smart ones. That left the question of the land. Carl owned 560 acres outright. No debt, no mortgages, clean title going back to his grandfather. The land was worth more now than it had ever been, and there were buyers. There were always buyers. Corporate farms, investment groups, younger farmers trying to expand. Carl could sell, take the money, and let someone else worry about rainfall and commodity prices and equipment loans. It would be the easeable thing to do. But Carl kept farming. He scaled back. He rented out a portion of his ground to Russell Doane in 2019 and kept 200 acres for himself. Equipment he could manage alone. Ground he knew by heart. No hired help. No debt. No expansion. It looked, Carl thought, exactly like the kind of operation his father would have approved of. In 2018, Carl turned 70. His knees were bad. His back was worse. He couldn't climb into the 8340's cab without a step stool, and even then it hurt. He listed the tractor for sale in the spring, asking $8,000. A dealer called and offered $6,000. Carl took it. The tractor sold to a farmer in South Dakota who needed a backup machine for a feedlot operation. Carl signed the title, deposited the check, and watched the flatbed pull out of his driveway on a Thursday morning in May. Janet asked him how he felt. He said fine. She didn't believe him. That night, Carl sat in the kitchen and did something he hadn't done in years. He pulled out the original loan paperwork from 1987, the papers he'd signed at Westfall, New Holland, with his father standing 10 feet away, saying nothing. The loan had been for $42,000. Over 16 years, with interest, Carl had paid back $61,000. The tractor had sold for $6,000. He thought about his father. He thought about the 80 acres Leonard's father had paid off in 1952. He thought about the fact that he was still farming that ground, that it was still in the family, that it had survived everything Carl had done to risk it. He thought about the fact that the New Holland 8340 had worked for 31 years without a major failure, that it had done everything Carl had asked it to do, and that none of that mattered now. The numbers told one story. The machine had cost more than it had returned. The loan had been a burden. The expansion it was supposed to enable never happened the way Carl had planned. By every financial measure, buying the New Holland 8340 in 1987 had been a mistake. But Carl had farmed for 47 years, and he knew that financial measures didn't tell the whole story. The 8340 had been there in 1996 when he took on the Rowley ground. It had been there in 1998 when he lost it. It had been there through the lean years and the average years and the occasional good year. It had been there when Leonard died, when the boys left, when the farm economy collapsed and recovered and collapsed again. The machine hadn't made Carl successful, but it had kept him farming. And for a farmer, sometimes that's the same thing. Carl kept the loan papers in a drawer in the kitchen. He didn't look at them often, but he didn't throw them away either. They were part of the record, part of the accounting. Every farm has one. The decisions that worked and the decisions that didn't, and the long stretch of years where you can't tell the difference. Carl had made a choice in 1987 that his father told him not to make. He'd spent 31 years living with it. And now the tractor was gone. And the loan was paid. And the only thing left was the land his grandfather had bought and his father had protected, and Carl had risked and somehow kept. In 2021, Carl was 78 years old. He still farmed his 200 acres. He still drove past Westfall, New Holland sometimes, though the dealership had changed hands twice since Bob Kemper retired. The building had been remodeled. The lot was full of machines Carl didn't recognize, with horsepower ratings that seemed impossible and price tags that seemed worse. He thought sometimes about the young farmers who walked onto that lot now, looking at new equipment the way Carl had looked at the 8340 in 1987. He wondered if their fathers gave them advice. He wondered if they listened. He wondered if it mattered. Farming had always been about making decisions with incomplete information and living with the consequences long enough to find out if you'd been right. Carl had made his decision. He'd lived with it. and the farm was still there. The New Holland 8340 had been gone for 3 years, but Carl still saw it sometimes in his mind. Parked in the second row at Westfall, New Holland, on a cold March afternoon in 1987. Clean and new and full of possibility. A machine that promised everything Carl wanted and delivered exactly what he'd paid for. Not success. Not failure. Just 31 years of work, and a loan that outlasted the argument that started it, and a farm that survived them both.